The last time I saw Holdy, he had long hair, and now he's chopped it off. And like Samson, he's no longer strong enough, but to be an atheist. Does that mean he's starting to try? Are we witnessing the deconstruction of the Canadian Catholic ex-long-haired wannabe philosopher? Giraffe, I hope so. Hello, I'm the Skeptic, the British floating circle that watches people make extraordinary claims, and then I explain why I don't accept what they're saying. Brian Holdsworth is apparently not strong enough to be an atheist, which is a new one. I've heard atheism is a religion, atheism is a belief system, atheism is just anger at God, but not strong enough. Well, that's a fresh one. Let's see what Brian's been bench pressing. However, before finding out why I apparently need God and long hair to lift heavy things, if this isn't your first Skeptic video, hit the like, the subscribe and the bell, and maybe the algorithm will start lifting its weight. And a super thanks to those that hit super thanks in some recent videos. Mikael Lundgren and Megatron Jenkins. And a big thank you to channel members who get to use Lisa the Rainbow Giraffe and more hen emojis. Lisa the Rainbow Giraffe bestows leaves upon you all. More hen. Well, I hope I'm strong enough to take this battering.
There are two kinds of atheism which sit at polar opposite ends of a spectrum, which I'll call the John Lennon kind and the Friedrich Nietzsche kind. Which isn't to say that Lennon was an atheist. I don't really know what he thought, but when I use him as one pole in this spectrum, I'm referring to his song, Imagine.
Imagine there's no Brian. It isn't hard to do. He had long hair before. Now he looks like... Never mind. Imagine is basically an atheist anthem, so I'll let him have that.
Which invites the listeners to imagine a world in which there's no religion and no heaven and no hell, all set to the soothing melodies of flowery 70s folk pop. He says that his optimistic vision isn't hard to imagine, and that if we could just believe in this simple creed, the world and all its people would live in peace and harmony.
Lovely song. Utopian? Yes. Naive? Doubtful. But imagine a world without religion causing wars is bang on the money. What I love is when religi bros sing it thinking it's a lovely song and they don't really listen to the lyrics. At least Brian is hearing what the words are saying.
Nietzsche's atheism, on the other hand, says that if we move on with a world without God, we will have to learn to cope with absolute meaninglessness. And in the final analysis, I have to admit that I'm not really brave or strong enough to live in either world.
Not strong enough to live without God. Not strong enough to face meaninglessness. So the answer is believe in a God, because it's easier. We have a word for that where I'm from. Lazy.
So in Lenin's vision, he tries to identify all the things that cause people to disagree and to fight, including national borders, private property, and religion. And he seems to suggest, well, he does more than suggest, that if we just got rid of those things, everyone would share and get along and never have a reason to hurt one another. For Lenin, the blame for all the evils that human beings fall prey to exists only in the external objects that tempt us or distort our moral benevolence.
I notice he hasn't mentioned that religion also has a fairly extensive track record of being one of those external objects that distorts moral benevolence and makes people do some really crazy shit.
So we just have to get rid of those things, and then the problems will go away with them. No more religion, no more countries, no more possessions. Which sounds nice, but is ultimately wildly naive. A well-researched phenomenon, actually called the commons dilemma, tells us that Lenin's optimism it's just wishful thinking. It's based on the observation that when a group has a limited resource, like let's say food, even if there's enough for everyone's need, enough people will act solely out of self-interest to take more than their fair share.
People are selfish, that's definitely real. Though it's important to note that religion hasn't exactly solved this. Churches have been hoarding land and money since, forever? And building super mega churches and blah blah blah. I'm 99% sure that there are so many churches in the USA because folks see it as a get-rich-quick scheme. Because preachers are selfish and want bigger trucks.
Or they'll neglect their responsibility in caring for that resource, which eventually leads to disaster for the group, which is why you need laws and why you need law enforcement, because there will always be people who cheat, steal, and who don't contribute to the common good. In fact, similar studies have been done that show that a lot of people, maybe a majority, who think of themselves as good and honest are still willing to lie at least a little if they think they can get some advantage for it, but not too much, because they still want to continue thinking of themselves as good and honest people. So we not only deceive others in our self-interest, but we're also willing to deceive ourselves about our deception.
Though I'm not sure believing in God fixes flawed humans is. Have you seen the news?
The reason people lie, cheat, kill, rape, and abuse each other isn't because religion or national borders or private property compels them to. It's because we're dishonest, violent, selfish, arrogant, lustful, and lazy and self-interested, kind of by nature.
All right, human nature is complicated, but religion isn't the cause of all evil doesn't mean religion isn't the cause of a lot of evil. Do you need a barn for all that straw man? And weren't humans created in the image of God? If humans are giant pricks, doesn't that make floaty man in the sky a bigger prick?
All of which is to say that Lenin's boomer atheism is pure sentimentality. It really does take a big imagination to convince yourself that if we just took his prescription for the world, it would inevitably lead to utopia and peace and harmony. What would actually happen is people would continue to act out of self-interest, fighting over external goods, and ideologues would then continue to blame the external goods for the disruption and then take them away until there was nothing left to take away.
Boomer atheism? Well, I think I might love that as a phrase, but Lenin was born in 1940, which technically makes him the silent generation, not boomer, so...
No one cares!
And nobody was more critical of this kind of secular sentimentalism than Nietzsche, who saw much more clearly the implications of the loss of God and the collective consciousness of the West. He was extremely critical of a kind of atheism that wanted to excise God but keep all the moral presuppositions of Christianity, such as compassion and charity, humility, equal dignity, etc.
Didn't compassion and charity exist before Christianity? Confucius was talking about treating others well 500 years before Jesus.
Nietzsche clearly saw that as soon as you displace God, you lose all of those things with him. In fact, when you lose God as the center of your cultural conscience, you lose any grounding in objective morality altogether. Lenin and probably most secularly inclined boomers thought that getting rid of religion would bring about peace, compassion, and global harmony without ever asking how one gives an account for why peace and compassion are objectively good in the first place. Nietzsche saw it for what it was, and he was critical of the atheistic movements of the Enlightenment, which tried to keep their Christian moral assumptions without God as its foundation. Like the earth just loosened from the gravity of the sun. He knew that without God, life lost all objective meaning, purpose, and moral order.
Does it though? Secular democracies constantly outperform religious ones on happiness, education, healthcare, and corruption. Norway seems fine, Brian. Denmark's doing okay. Nobody's wandering the fjords sobbing about meaninglessness.
And he saw himself as one of the few who had the mental fortitude and the will to do what was necessary in the aftermath of the death of God, which was create a new value system to replace the old. He called the old traditional Christian morality, which he hated, slave morality, with all its concern for the poor, the underdog, the widow, the orphan. It gave too much influence to the weak, who out of their weakness were prone to resenting the strong and the powerful. And as long as we nurtured Christianity as the center of our moral sensibilities, then the resentful and envious weak, or the slaves, would always hold back the strong and the powerful.
And that is why he is more useful as words of caution than as Mr. Life Coach. Stop helping the weak, they're holding us back is not the advice he thought it was.
And the rest of society along with them. Instead, he promoted what he called master morality, which begins with self-affirmation, but not the kind of emotional positivity that we see everywhere today. This is a kind of willfulness that simply assesses the power that a person has and sees it as good and placed in the service. It should be placed in the service of self-interest. And it should never be conditioned by virtues like humility or charity, but instead something that should be uncompromisingly asserted without care for who it might offend.
So his ideal human is basically a guy who cuts in queues and doesn't tip.
This is why his philosophy resonates so much and is often first grasped and enthusiastically embraced by 20-something-year-old young men. It's because they're in the prime of their life and they feel invincible. So when someone comes along and says, you should embrace that. You should affirm your strength and your power and not let yourself be distracted by compromising with the needs of others. That kind of flattery can be very persuasive.
He's not wrong. It's basically the philosophy of, I just discovered I have opinions and nobody can stop me. Most people grow out of that, though.
But there's two very big problems with this way of thinking. Nietzsche attacks Christian morality on the grounds that it's mere convention masquerading as something metaphysically real, and then claims that a new value system has to be created to replace it, which is our right as moral beings. We define what is good and true. But then he goes on to take for granted that strength, power, and vitality are all moral goods that a new world should be built around. He completely neglects that his new morality is subject to the same polemics he used against Christianity.
Right. And with that logic, Lisa the Rainbow Giraffe Leaf be upon her also does that with universal poop. Good on you, girl.
For the first quarter of our lives, we're dependent upon those who have strength and knowledge to care for us. For the first 10 years or so, we are desperately weak and dependent. Then by our 20s, we may feel pretty invincible, but we're still often very inexperienced and naive. Then we enter a short period of our lives where we have both strength of body and mind and experience and training if we're lucky. That lasts for maybe 20 years, and then we start to experience sharp physical decline again, at which point the strong could easily take advantage of us if they wanted to again.
We're all weak for large portions of our lives. We all need other people. The strong caring for the weak isn't slave morality, though it's just how humans be human. So what?
I have experience, of being strong and proud in my life too, and in my proudest moments, out of my arrogance, I might have been slightly persuaded by Nietzsche's philosophy. But that kind of strength doesn't last, and incredibly ironically, nobody illustrates that fact better than the proud philosopher himself. Ultimately, his life serves as a cautionary tale because in his quest to define morality for himself, he gave himself all kinds of permission to live as he pleased and ended up becoming helplessly mentally and physically infirm by the time he was only 44, supposedly from late-stage syphilis infection.
Wait, he got syphilis, therefore his philosophy's wrong? That's not how philosophy works, Brian. Isaac Newton had mental illness. That doesn't mean gravity's wrong.
And thank God for him and for all of us, because we are all ultimately helpless and weak and in need of the generosity and charity of the strong. If Nietzsche lived in the kind of world he imagined and he affirmed, he never would have grown to a strong intellectual or physical stature, and nor would anyone have given him the delicate care he needed at the end of his life. Which is why I'm not embarrassed to admit that I'm personally not strong enough to be an atheist. I'm not strong enough to delude myself the way Lenin did with such gullible sentimentalism. I'm not strong enough to live in the kind of godless, man-centered world that Nietzsche promoted. And neither was he, and frankly, neither are you.
And there it is. You're not strong enough to be an atheist, not because atheism requires strength, but because without God, according to Brian, everything is meaningless and nobody will care for the weak, and you'll probably get syphilis or something. 10 out of 10, would atheist again.
Well, there's no necessity or natural imperative for any of us to care for those who find themselves in a position of less strength than we do. Unless everyone adopts that willingness, nobody will ever become strong enough to do anything good. It's one of the great paradoxes of the world we find ourselves in. Strength prevails, yeah, but nobody becomes strong without first being at the mercy of the strong for extended periods of time.
Jesus' conclusion. Lasai. All that for a bit of Jeebus. So, Lenin was a naive boomer, and humans are selfish by nature. The strong should care for the weak, and Brian isn't strong enough to be an atheist. Well, no shit, Sherlock. Here's the thing, B to the Izzle. Religion is better than meaninglessness isn't the same as God exists. Which Brian just managed to miss out entirely. I guess his haircut also affected his memory as well as his strength. Did Brian convince you? Let me know in the section below. Just imagine I'm going to skeptic this. A big thank you to this month's top level ticks on Patreon: Elizabeth, Jakari, William, Rick, George, Mark, Tamo and Mikhail Lundgren, as well as all the $3 base ticks and channel members. You can become a supporter on Patreon too at patreon.com/theskeptic. The link is in the description, along with links to all my other socials. Or become a member by hitting the join button below this video. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. From me, the Skeptic, stay safe, keep thinking logically and ask questions. Skepticism is the first step towards truth. See you next Saturday.